to introduce you to our speaker today, Kelly Berry. Kelly is a health promotion leader with more than 15 years of experience advancing workplace behavioral health, employee well-being, and organizational culture change. She designs enterprise-level strategies that strengthen mental well-being, engagement, and healthy behaviors across large, diverse workforces. Kelly specializes in translating behavioral health and prevention science into practical workplace solutions that address stress, burnout, caregiving demands, and generational workforce dynamics. Her work focuses on the organizational and cultural factors that influence health outcomes, workforce performance, and long-term cost trends. Welcome, Kelly. We're really excited to hear from you today.
Thank you. Excited to chat. As I've already advanced the slides without even knowing it. All right, well, I will go ahead and jump in. I know this is sort of a continuation from the previous training session back in March, talking about generational differences and how they show up in the workplace with mental health. And so this is sort of from awareness of those differences into action. What do we do with those differences? How do we approach them so that we can all thrive together? A little bit of sort of a review, we'll say, of what we're looking at in the workforce. We currently have 5 generations represented. The largest majority of those generations are in the millennial and Gen Z groups, so some of what has been considered sort of younger workers, and that absolutely shows up in what mental health looks like within the workplace. And each generation sort of comes with its own set of social norms and expectations. I think as we're talking about these generational differences, I want to be really careful that we're not stereotyping entire groups of people by their ages. Everyone is unique, but what we're talking about is sort of a shared historical context that obviously deeply shapes people's perspectives and priorities and kind of how they view life. And so keeping that in mind as we're talking about all of these labeled generations, that, you know, really this is just kind of some shared historical social norms within those groups of people. All right. Why does this matter? How are we seeing this show up? So statistically, we talked about, the largest groups that we're seeing, those that Gen X, not Gen X, millennials and Gen Z, those younger employees that are kind of coming up in the workplace. What we're seeing in terms of mental health for those two particular demographics are unfortunately really, really high rates of mental health challenges. So statistically, when we talk about mental health in this country, and all of what we're talking about is based on US population statistics, 1 in 5 US adults experience a mental illness every year. The exception to that is 18 to 25-year-olds. We see that with a little bit more a common experience. 1 in 3 have that experience each year. So certainly this can show up in what it looks like in the workplace. Higher stress, greater experiences of loneliness in that younger Gen Z demographic. What I think is really important to sort of acknowledge as we're framing this conversation and the way that it shows up in the workplace, and why it's really important to, I say target it, but what I really mean is support it, create systems that allow people to kind of connect more effectively. What we know about mental health in the work is that half of all full-time employees have left a job for mental health reasons. When we look at the generational breakdown, 68% of millennials have left a job, a full-time job, for mental health reasons, and then 81% of Gen Z have left a job. And then when you look at some projection data for Gen Alpha, which are, some of the kids coming up now, they're anticipating that mental health support is one of the most important things that generation is going to look for in their future employer. So I say that because, this is not a nice to have thing. I think this really becomes a conversation of retention, attraction, workforce attraction, and then even kind of bigger picture workforce sustainability. I've worked with a number of industries across the years, from construction, healthcare. I was recently at a conference where healthcare, but more specific with pharmacists, all are doing a ton of work to recruit future generations to come into their industry, right? Some even targeting as young as middle school. My question on the flip side of that model, yes, we want to attract younger talent, but if those middle school, high school, college age students that you're trying to get to come into your industry were to ask someone currently employed in your industry, what's that experience like? What is that person going to tell those students? And so both prongs when we talk about workforce sustainability are so, so important. What I want to kind of broaden this conversation to are really just national trends in sort of the cultural context that we find ourselves in. Because I think as we're talking about what we're seeing with mental health within the workplace and that generational differences, understanding kind of the climate that we find ourselves in is really interesting and I think important. It's that why behind some of the behaviors that we're seeing showing up, and that why I think can really help drive better empathy as we hopefully can connect with each other a little bit better. There is a speaker I'm going to drop in the chat. She's a generation researcher. Her name is Kristen Scroggins. And this is a video that she did. She's a keynote speaker at a conference where she was talking about generational differences and kind of how they show up. For sake of time, we can't go into that. It's over an hour long, but really gold in terms of understanding what makes us tick with some of those different norms in these different subsets of, Boomer, Gen X, Millennial, all those pieces. So highly recommend checking that out. But I want us to get the lay of the land as we're moving through this conversation. So what does the data tell us in terms of like big problems that we're facing on a national scale? This is the U.S. Surgeon General report that was released in 2024 talking about parental stress. And so obviously, a lot of generations can find themselves in a parent or caregiver role, but certainly what we've seen historically are really, really high rates of youth mental health challenges. We've seen higher rates and they've done a little bit more effort there, so we are seeing some of those come down. But certainly what this report really told us is that as some of our kids are not okay, the parents and the adults in their lives that are looking after them are also not okay. And so again, someone is going through beyond how they shove us, or maybe in front of a screen if we're not face to face. But recognizing if there are kind of caregiving aspects, that there are other pieces. Certainly right now, financial strain, when we look at stress trends, so things to be aware of. Another piece kind of this year's U.S. Surgeon General report was this truly epidemic of isolation that our country is experiencing. And this is not unique to the U.S. We certainly see it kind of globally as well in a lot of other developed nations. What's really interesting with this data, not necessarily certainly from a mental health standpoint, but even from just a broader overall health standpoint, the study found that individuals experiencing isolation, or that isolation itself, was more damaging to someone's physical health than smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So profound impacts from this lack of connection. And the charts that you're seeing here go back to, where they're studying back to the early 2000s, but this was really a phenomenon that was studied in the 90s. I don't know if any of you will remember, there's a book that was published in the 90s by Retnam called Bowling Alone, that was really talking about this cultural shift away from community, away from a lot of these third party spaces where we connect with other people and we feel this sense of belonging and connectedness to something bigger than ourselves. Think back to, I mean, my own personal family, grandparents had a supper club that, they went to for decades, the same people once a month. We don't see that as much anymore. It used to be very common where people in your community everyone would join the Rotary Club or even PTA in schools. We're seeing a real shift away from this. And this is something that is not specific to the pandemic, has been going on for decades. So as the workplace becomes a place where more of us are around other people and there's that loss of those third party spaces, finding ways to connect becomes really, really crucial. And I want to add another layer to this specifically. So this was a more recent report from Gallup. And if you're not familiar with Gallup, they're a global research group that studies workforce trends. There was a report that they put out in May of last year talking about these unbelievable rates of loneliness with young men, specifically in our country, where we were seeing men 18 to 35 were kind of the loneliest demographic compared to other men their age in other similarly developed nations. What's really staggering is you can kind of see the bottom of this quote of the impact of that, of seeing that, these individuals, when that condition kind of persisted and became more severe, we saw things like what they call dying deaths of despair. So this loneliness has profound impacts. I've spent a lot of my career, certainly in like public health, but a lot in the prevention space, which is kind of like an upstream modality. So in that space, we talk a lot about protective factors. So what are the pieces that we can put in place that are going to mitigate or lessen the severity of different health conditions? And I bring that up because when we talk about mental health in particular, we know, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, but I'm saying this with like a lot of data and evidence to back it. Our social connections are one of the most protective factors, not just for mental health, but for overall health. I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole, but there was even a book that was published earlier. I think it was either beginning of this year or late last year by a neuroscientist called Our Brains Need Friends. So I'm like on this soapbox because if you take nothing away from this little 20-minute chunk, I want you to take away how important it is for people to feel seen, to feel like people around them care, and to be connected with in appropriate ways. And I'm going to some examples of what appropriate ways looks like in just a little bit. But framing up the context of really where we're finding ourselves nationally, not just with that younger demographic, but what we've all gone through and oftentimes how that is going to show up in the workplace. None of this has anything to do with work in particular, but it's, we don't live in severance where we're sort of isolated and nothing outside of work comes into work. Everything from work impacts stuff at home, and stuff at home outside of work impacts how we show up at work. So that context really matters. So where we oftentimes see these generational differences show up, and again, these are really those like cultural norm experiences for different generations, can be in communication style and channel. I've had several colleagues who maybe have some younger team members who the thought of making a telephone call to someone is terrifying, and like that is not a modality that they feel comfortable using. Whereas older generations, really, really easy. That was a social norm that we grew up with. Feedback and expectations around feedback can differ depending on generations, views on flexibility and boundaries. And I'm going to add a little bit of context to this one. Going back to that parental stress statistic, and the views on flexibility and boundaries. We know there are oftentimes disparities with how these things show up. What I mean by that, in terms of flexibility, in September of 2020, we saw over 800,000 women leave the workforce in that month alone. 4 times more women than men left the workforce in that month. A lot of that was due to caregiving responsibilities. And so understanding that, there may be demographics. Okay, I need to crank through. Different groups experience different things differently. And then the last piece, comfort discussing mental health. Younger groups were sort of brought up where this is more of a social norm, whereas older groups not so much. And I could keep talking about that for a while, but for sake of time, we're going to keep cranking. This is sort of where, when I talked about how important it is to connect with people, where that connection can sometimes go awry. What, in terms of validate the person. Hey, I see you. You don't need to give advice or offer solutions. Practice kind of active listening. But these are some things to kind of be aware of. I think sometimes there is a tendency to sort of say like, oh, I've been there before. It's okay. It gets better. And there are ways to frame that where that feels validating. It feels like I see you. But we want to make sure that we're being intentional with how our words process we're talking. Certainly sometimes we can communicate something and that message is not received as intended. So how we connect with people certainly matters. So cornerstone of all of this, of recognizing that we all have different social norms and different experiences, but how we get better at moving through those is to be intentional to try to connect with people, try to understand what's going on, understand what challenges they're facing, and then clarify. And I don't, if anyone was able to jump on last month as we were sort of talking through this, what mental health support does not mean in the workplace. It does not mean that you lower the bar or you lower standards. It can mean, hey, this is what we need for this role. I can connect with you, care about you personally, and also say, and this is where we need you to be. What scaffolding can we put in place to help get you there? All right. For sake of time, I always talk too much. I'm going to move on. So what do these tools look like? Foundation of this is really emotional intelligence. And if you're not familiar, there's sort of like a four-square model that Daniel Goldman, 2 researchers, put together to kind of really give guidelines on what this looks like. Foundational piece is self-awareness, of recognizing our own feelings and our own emotions, which is a hard thing to name. I'm feeling frustrated. That's different than I'm feeling bad, right? There's a little bit more granularity there. But then also recognizing how we may be coming across to other people, recognizing our own biases and how they may show up. And then that empathy of again, that's where we were talking about the why behind some of these general differences, connecting to people in a way that expresses understanding and compassion. A great way to do that, because I gave you some scenarios of words that are not super helpful and not great at connecting, is an acronym called OARS, which is a type of motivational interviewing. And essentially what this is active listening. It is pausing in this moment, being fully present with that person and saying, hey, what does support look like in this? affirmation. Thank you for sharing that with me, reflecting it back. This is what, this is sort of your mirror moment, if you will. Like, this is what I'm getting. Is this what you're saying? And then summarizing is like, okay, big picture. This is what, you're telling me. This is what you need. And this is what I can do. So this is really a great way to kind of make sure that we're on the same page as we're moving through these conversations and support together. Foundation of this is if you're not familiar with the concept of psychological safety, this is really the idea that someone can speak up, express dissent, express challenges, express what's going on with mental health without fear of judgment, retribution. So sort of like I can express truth without fear that it's going to cost me. So this is really kind of a foundational piece of mental health support. If I can speak up and I'm going to be able to get the help that I need, and people aren't going to judge me. Last piece here, because I see Sarah popping up, so I will wrap up here on this slide. There is a great book called Radical Candor by Kim Scott that really talks to this specifically. So a key piece of this is people have to feel like you care about them before you can kind of support them appropriately. So that connection piece really comes from caring. And then also making sure we're being direct with kind of feedback and things as well. I know I've probably gone over there, so I will very quickly wrap up. I think Zay is going to drop my contact information in the chat if you want more information, you have questions about any of this. But kind of summary, recognize where we're coming from, that every generation has some context that sort of shaped how they show up and the experiences that they've lived with. Using language like ORs and those open-ended questions of kind of guiding those conversations. They're a bridge that really help us connect with people in empathetic and non-judgmental ways. Finally, that last piece there, sorry, computer issues. That standard of care, that psychological safety is really that foundation that all of this is built on. When people feel like you care about them, all of the other stuff, those hard conversations, are a whole lot easier to have.